Hi, everyone. Um, Today we are going to discuss imperialism. In the last chapter, we talked about um, industrialization and modernization and how the world was changing so much. Um, and it's important to remember as we go into imperialism that industrialization opened doors to new markets for new goods. And so England was processing in factories, textiles, for example, that they could sell in other places. And so this became a thing where you produced goods and then you went and you attempted to expand your control into these areas. And once you conquered new peoples, essentially, um, then you would force them to buy your goods. And so it feels like we already did this with the age of exploration. We conquered new places, we forced those people to work for us, we exploited their resources, and in a way, this is kind of round two on a much grander scale. And so we're going to start with the PowerPoint that I uploaded, chapter 25, lesson 1, imperialism. And the question is, what is imperialism? And when you think of imperialism, think of one very powerful nation extending its control over other lands. This kind of imperialism that's happening in the 19th century, so the late 18, early 1900s, is called new imperialism because it takes direct control over the colonies. So, for example, in the 16 and 1700s, the English colonists in America weren't under direct control of the British king. Um, they had governors, they had a lot of independence to kind of do the things that they wanted to do, and we saw what the result of that was, which was the American Revolution. But this is really a very different type of expansion and control. And so in your textbook, um, it talks about imperialism in lots of different places. So if we're on the world map, which is the second slide, you can see all the different colors represented on that map. And each of those colors represents a country, a European country, or even the United States that conquered new areas. So if you take a moment and you look at that map, you can see that this is a big deal in the 1900s. And we'll look at it starting with Southeast Asia. So those areas on the map, as far to the right as you can go, that's the focal point of at least chapter 25, lesson 1. So I think it's a great visual to look at that map and see each of those colors on that map represents a country that was controlling. So why are people going to these new places? Well, like I said, as industrialization occurs, people have more products that they want to get rid of and that they want to force people to buy. So an economic motive would be the first thing. New markets, we want to conquer new lands to force them to buy stuff from us. We also want to conquer those new lands in order to exploit their resources. And so when we look at Southeast Asia, you see spices and tea and cotton and a lot of other things that again are valuable. The other thing about imperialism is that it is kind of it represents power. The more land you have, the more power you do. So if you're like England, if you went back to that slide where you saw the map, they probably ruled most of lots of lands around the globe. The saying at the time was that the sun never sets on the British Empire. So the more land you have, the more power you have, the more wealth you have. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this new imperialism in chapter 25, lesson 1, is that it's tied to racism. And the belief in the late 1800s was that there were certain races of people who were more likely to dominate than others. And this is coming from a European Christian kind of perspective. So, anybody who's going and expanding into Asia or into Africa are doing it because, yes, they want to make money, and yes, they want to have more land because that represents power, but they also believe that the people in these lands are actually heathenists. Is that even a word? I don't know. They're heathens. Okay. And so you look at Southeast Asia, they're practicing different religions. The people are darker skinned, or they have different colored skin. Africa, darker skin. And for European Christians and who are looking for reasons to expand, this is one of them. Let's go and colonize. Let's convert people. So it feels very much like the age of exploration that we talked about a long time ago. And those motives tied to social Darwinism is it kind of connects you to that white man's burden activity under practice quizzes, which is assigned that you need to do after this. By the way, social Darwinism is a bunch of crap. I hate to say crap, but I did. It is what most historians call a junk science. We know what Darwinism is. We know the idea of the survival of the fittest. What social Darwinism does is says it's not just a species of animal that's more likely to survive, but it's certain races of people who are more likely to survive. And the white European is, person who's Christian is going to be more likely to survive. And so social Darwinism really created quite a bit of racism and anti-Semitism on top of it in Europe. So something to think about. When we talk about European countries going into new lands, they are going to go, we're looking at Asia, Southeast Asia. The first, and we're on slide, what slide is this? We're on slide 5, okay? Slide 5 talks about lands that Great Britain conquered or even established. Singapore, for example, was founded by Sir Thomas Raffles, and that is an important area if you go back to the map, because it's actually kind of a jumping off point for the British to do business with the Chinese. Another area that the British will take over is Burma. I recommend that you go back, and because there's India and Burma and China, and it's all kind of, everybody's trying to take one place after the other. So Great Britain is going to have some control in Southeast Asia. We definitely know they're already controlling India, but they've expanded beyond that. France will go into Vietnam, Cambodia, Tonkin, and Annam. And one thing that you should remember here is that as people are grabbing all these new lands, European powers are grabbing new lands, it creates this sense of competition. And so when we look at World War I, we're going to see that imperialism was one of the factors that caused World War I. So keep that in mind. The only area in Southeast Asia that was actually free of European power was Thailand. If you've ever seen the musical The King and I, It was known as Siam for a period of time. And the reason why the Siamese people essentially remained free was that they focused on Western learning, and they had their doors kind of, their doors cracked open a little bit to do business with Europeans. And that, I think, was the ticket, was to stay open-minded and to not just, I guess, shut their doors. China had shut their doors. The Japanese had shut their doors. They were very worried about Europeans. And when you look at the political cartoon activity that I'm going to have you do another day, you'll see, or maybe it's this day, I can't remember what your homework is, you'll see that China didn't have a chance. And so, the Thailand or Siam was smart enough to leave themselves open to learning new things and modernizing, because that's what's going to keep them protected. So we looked at Britain, we looked at France. The United States is going to get in this game. The Spanish-American War, fought by Commodore George Dewey, will defeat the Spanish. Now, one thing you should know is after that Treaty of Tordesillas, a long, long time ago, remember that the Western Hemisphere fell under Spanish control. So the Philippines was under Spanish control, and the United States wanted the Philippines as a way of doing business with the Chinese. So they fought the Spanish-American War, and they took the Philippines from the Spanish. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this is that even the Americans believed that it was their duty to go and conquer people who looked different than they did, people who were darker skinned and darker eyed, and this Spanish-American War, as it resulted in the United States taking the Philippines, was not a good thing. The Chinese were not happy about this, and the Chinese and the Filipinos actually led a movement for independence with a person named Emilio Aguinaldo. So this imperialism is not always received well by the people who are living there. If you move to the next map, you will see the map of everything east of, I guess, the Middle East and Southeast Asia, as far north as Russia. You can really see the extent in which everybody just grabbed. Imagine that it's like a bunch of Xavier girls with delicious cookies at break. Everybody's grabbing for one, and this leads to some big problems, and especially later on down the road when a lot of European countries pull out of these areas, it's going to be a bigger problem. So look at that map. Okay. One thing I do want to talk to you about is the types of colonial rule. So if I'm an imperialist power, I'm the United States, I'm going to go establish my control into new areas. I'm going to colonize. One thing I did need to discuss about the United States is that the United States would eventually take Hawaii, which was a monarchy, and also Haiti and for a period of time, Cuba and Samoa, and the Philippines. So the United States was really kind of on board with this expansion. I wanted to talk to you about, if I can get back here to the types of colonial rule. My computer is having a problem. There's two kinds of colonial rules. So some countries followed one way, some followed the other. For indirect rule, you could, I would say, I colonize, I establish control over an area, but I allow the local rulers to continue um, ruling, and people would be more likely to listen to them. So the Dutch East India Company in the 16 and 1700s used this kind of rule, and it's cheaper because you don't have to hire people and officials to go live there and rule. So, and often I think it was more effective. The problem with indirect rule is that often people rebelled. The other kind of rule that Great Britain and France used was direct rule. And what that means is elite nobles and rulers are basically kicked out, and you have Western officials, those viceroys, those governors are brought in, and they are going to rule and kind of implement what we're calling the blessings of Western civilization, which would be reading, and English, speaking English, wearing European style clothing, converting to Christianity. So between the two types of rule, indirect and direct, they both have their benefits, but most of these areas where you see colonial rule will experience uprisings and revolt, mostly based on nationalism and this idea that we only want to be ruled by people like ourselves. I don't want to be, living in I don't know, in India and I want to be under Indian control. I don't want to be under British control. So there's a lot of uprisings as a result of nationalism. And, Europeans were not particularly respectful of the customs and religions and traditions of the conquered peoples. And why would they? I mean, this is, throughout most of history, we've seen Europeans kind of bulldoze in and basically do whatever the heck they want. So, imperialism opens up new markets for new goods. There's a ton of natural resources. It definitely makes you more powerful in a sense if you're a colonial power, but it creates a lot of tension within the country. It creates a lot of competition, and it's going to create a lot of nationalism and uprising amongst indigenous peoples who don't want to be ruled by a foreigner. So keep that in mind, and hopefully it makes some sense. If you have any questions, you can email me them and I can answer. So I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.